I'm Stuart Kelly. I'm a writer and critic, and it's a pleasure to be here for the Big Bang Week as part of the Woodtown Book Festival to speak with Andrew Robinson about his book Einstein on the Run. It's a book which is illuminating about the science, but very effective in terms of understanding Einstein as a man rather than just a thinker. Now, there have been a few gremlins in terms of technology, so if there is any spooky action at a distance, forgive us. Andrew, I just wanted to ask one question to begin with, which was why Einstein?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Sorry, I wanted to ask, why did you choose Einstein? I've read your previous works, and they were very much about philology rather than physics.
Oh, the reason I chose him was that in the centenary of the discovery of special relativity by Einstein, that's 2005, I published a first book on Einstein, and it had contributions from all over the world, including Nobel Prize winners, but somehow the book didn't quite do justice to Britain and Einstein's relationship with Britain. So I felt another book was needed.
Well, just outline very briefly why you think this English interregnum is so important in the story of Einstein.
You mean his relationship with Britain?
Yes.
Yes. Well, it went on for half a century, so I think it's crucial. It started when he was a young man, a teenager, and it lasted right up to the end of his life. And I'll tell you the details in a moment, but it lasted a long time throughout his working life.
In which case, that's the perfect opportunity for you to tell us about the ideas and the history behind the book. I believe you have some slides, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Let's start with that one. Yes. Well, whenever we think of the world's best-known scientist, we generally picture him in relation to Germany, where Einstein was born, or to Switzerland, where he first became a physicist, or the United States, where he settled during his last 2 decades. This photo shows him in his last years in 1951 in his study in Princeton, New Jersey. There's a portrait of Mahatma Gandhi on the wall behind him, who he had great respect for. The other place we might think of in association with Einstein is Israel. Because he willed, after his death, he left his massive archives to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem because of his Jewish sympathies. Now, Britain is less often considered, but I think it's no exaggeration to say that Britain is the country that made Einstein into the worldwide phenomenon he is today. Profound and creative, Einstein's entanglement with Britain was both intellectual and emotional. In 1927, while he was still living in Germany, he wrote to a British physicist in Oxford, Frederick Lindemann, "In England, my work has received greater recognition than anywhere else in the world." And in 1933, while revisiting Britain, he remarked with rather uncharacteristic fervor to a London journalist, "I love this country." And in 1937, once he had relocated himself from Europe to the United States, he told a refugee German Jewish physicist in Edinburgh, Max Born, who was a friend of his from way back, "Britain is the most civilized country of the day." And he wrote that from America to Born in Edinburgh. Now, Einstein's relationship with Britain flourished, as I was just saying, for over half a century. In the 1890s, when he was a young man, British theoretical and experimental physics, as epitomized by Isaac Newton and James Clerk Maxwell, sparked his scientific development during his school and college education in Switzerland. Then in 1919, British astronomers led by Arthur Eddington confirmed Einstein's general theory of relativity through a solar eclipse, and this made Einstein internationally famous. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. This shows Einstein sitting in 1930 with Arthur Eddington in Cambridge at the observatory in Cambridge, which was Eddington's home, having a chat. And in 1933, Einstein was saved from likely assassination by Nazi extremists in Germany by Britain, which offered him refuge. And he came here and he planned to become a British citizen. And then finally, in 1955, Britain gave rise to Einstein's most enduring political statement, known as the Russell-Einstein Manifesto Against the Spread of Nuclear Weapons during the Cold War, initiated by Bertrand Russell. And that was the very last document signed by Einstein before his death in 1955. Now, the inspiration for his special theory of relativity, published in 1905, was unquestionably British physics. On the walls of his apartment in 1920s Berlin, and later in Princeton in his house, Einstein hung portraits of three British natural philosophers, Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday, and James Clerk Maxwell from Scotland. And no other scientists, just these three. And he said, England has always produced the best physicists. That was said in 1925 to a young Jewish woman, Esther Salomon, who was attending his relativity lectures in Berlin. And he advised Salomon to study physics at the University of Cambridge, which was the home of Newton and the scientific home of Maxwell, and of course, Arthur Eddington in his own time. Now, in June 1921, a century ago, Einstein visited Britain for the first time at the invitation of Lord Richard Haldane, who was born in Edinburgh and grew up and was educated at the University in Edinburgh. And he was a former Lord Chancellor, a lifelong Germanophile, and the author of a best-selling philosophical study of relativity. Next slide, please. And this shows Einstein in Haldane's house in London in 1921, being photographed by the press. Haldane is watching. He's the second person on the left. Now, the highlight of this London visit, his very first visit to England, to the UK, was a lecture at King's College London, and the lecture hall had been arranged by Haldane, and the hall was packed out with scores of students standing all around the walls. Haldane got to his feet and introduced Einstein with the following words: "You are in the presence of the Newton of the 20th century." But no one in the audience applauded Einstein. Such was the anti-German feeling in Britain in the aftermath of the First World War. Now he began to speak following Haldane, and he spoke in German, first about British physics and then about relativity, his theory. And the silence in the hall continued. And then at some point later in the lecture, Einstein paused and said in German, "My lecture is already a little long." And then there came a storm of applause from all parts of the hall. And he said, "I shall take that as an invitation." And he smiled, and the applause was redoubled. Now, his growing fame and generous personal welcome in Britain from this period onwards must have been a rather piquant experience for Einstein, because back in Germany, in the same period, there was the birth of a vociferous anti-relativity movement, along with increasing abuse of Einstein as a Jew, accentuated by his declared sympathy from 1921 onwards for the Zionist goal of establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine, in addition to abuse of him for his increasing sympathy for international pacifism. And by 1922, Einstein was he felt he was at risk of being assassinated following the death of the shooting of Walter Rathenau, his friend in Germany. And he actually left Germany to travel abroad to escape the risk of being killed. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Now, he traveled all the way to Japan and gave lectures. And then he came back with his wife together, and they stopped in Palestine. And this shows the group in Palestine. Einstein is the second from the right, his wife second from the left at the front. And they're standing in Government House with the High Commissioner of Palestine, Sir Herbert Samuel, who's third from the left. And Samuel became a friend of Einstein after this visit. And in fact, Einstein stayed with him in London in 1930. Now, in 1925, the Royal Society awarded Einstein its highest honor, the Copley Medal, which had been given to Faraday in 1838. And soon after this, Oxford University began a fruitful relationship with Einstein, involving 3 fairly short visits to Oxford in 1931, 32, and 33. And the driving force behind this was Frederick Lindemann, who I mentioned briefly earlier. He was a professor of physics based at Christ Church College in Oxford, who later became the chief scientific advisor to Winston Churchill. Next slide, please. Now, this shows Lindemann, the dark man, the advisor at the back, and Churchill at the front, of course, in a post-war cartoon. Now, Lindemann was acting in the 1920s to try and persuade Einstein to come to Oxford on behalf of the Rhodes trustees, who wanted to launch lectures in memory of Cecil Rhodes. And in 1931, Einstein finally agreed to come, and he stayed in rooms at Christ Church College, and he gave 3 lectures at Rhodes House, and he accepted an honorary doctorate from Oxford University. Next slide, please. And this photograph shows Einstein in his doctoral garb after the ceremony in Oxford, in central Oxford. And the scientific content of his lectures, the 3 lectures he gave, was of no lasting significance, because it either repeated Einstein's existing published work on relativity, or it was soon rendered redundant by new ideas from Einstein and other physicists. More interesting, I think, than the physics in this occasion is the reaction of the very mixed Oxford audience, some of whom knew no German, which was the language of the lecture, and others no mathematics. And the Oxford Times, the newspaper, tried to capture the atmosphere in its report. It wrote as follows: Professor Einstein, wearing his new doctor's robes, acknowledged the applause which greeted his appearance by smiling and bowing. As the lecture proceeded, not only equations, but a singular diagram appeared on the blackboard, and Professor Einstein gesticulated helpfully in curves with the chalk to explain it. Later, the diagrams were rubbed off in favor of more formulae and the better informed members of the audience were kept busy taking the formulae down. What it didn't say is that the Dean of Christ Church College, who was a theologian, had fallen asleep in the front row because he didn't understand any mathematics. Next slide, please. This is Einstein's blackboard from the second lecture in Oxford in 1931. And these blackboards from his lectures had a rather curious afterlife because some Oxford dons at the lectures favoured preserving them. And Einstein was definitely opposed to this idea. According to his diary, preservation smacked of personality cult. That's what he thought. And he was against it. Well, whether he would approve or not, one of his blackboards shown here is the most famous object today in Oxford's History of Science Museum. And people come literally from all over the world just to see it. Now, physics took up only part of Einstein's time in Oxford. For example, he played his violin, famous for his violin playing, many times with a semi-professional chamber music group in Oxford. And he also spoke to various groups about politics, including his strongly held pacifism. And he also wandered around Oxford all on his own. Next slide, please. And this photo, rather charming photo, was taken in Oxford in 1931. Nobody knows who took it, but presumably, or where it was taken in Oxford, presumably he was just having a walk. Now, it was on one of these occasions when he was walking, he had a chance encounter with an undergraduate from the university, William Golding, the future author of Lord of the Flies and a Nobel Prize winner in literature, a future Nobel Prize winner, who had started his undergraduate career in Oxford as a science student and then changed to literature. Sometime in 1931, Golding tells us that he happened to be standing on a small bridge in Magdalen College Deer Park overlooking the river in Oxford when, as he put it, a tiny moustached and hatted figure joined me. Professor Einstein knew no English at that time, and I knew only 2 words of German. I beamed at him, trying wordlessly to convey by my bearing all the affection and respect that the English felt for him. And for 5 minutes, the unknown undergraduate and the world-famous scientist just stood there, watching the river without speaking. And then finally, Einstein looked at a fish in the river and said in German, "Fish." And Golding reacted immediately with his comment, the only 2 words he knew in German, "Fish, ja, ja." And then they stood for another 5 minutes silently. And Golding then said, Professor Einstein, his whole figure, still conveying goodwill and amiability, drifted away out of sight. Now, of course, he also spent time in Christ Church College, although Einstein never really had much time for Oxford's dinner jackets and gowns. He referred to himself in a poem written in Oxford as a barbarian among the Holy Brotherhood in tails. Now, next slide, please. He's not standing in his tails here. He's obviously in a suit, but he's in the main quadrangle of Christ Church College, Oxford, in May or June of 1933 on his 3rd visit. And he's now a political refugee from Nazi Germany because during March of 1933, shortly after Adolf Hitler came to power, Einstein had publicly criticized the repressive policies of the new National Socialist government in Germany. And he actually abandoned his home in Berlin and all his money and found a temporary home on the coast of Belgium with his wife. And in response to this, the Nazis burnt his scientific works publicly in Berlin, along with a lot of other works. Next slide, please. And one of the Nazi newspapers published this cartoon in April of 1933, showing Einstein being jackbooted out of the German consulate in Brussels for having the absurd idea that he wanted to give up his German citizenship. Now, there was a very prominent anti-Semitic German publication at this time, approved by Joseph Goebbels, and it showed a photograph of many Jews, including Einstein, and underneath it, Einstein's photo, it said rather sinister words in capital letters. It said "bis jetzt ungehängt," which means not yet hanged. And it was around this time, in late May, that Einstein headed back to Oxford. And in late June, having stayed in England, he returned to Belgium. But in late July, he came back to Britain. And then he met Winston Churchill at his country house, Chartwell, and in a private meeting to discuss the Nazi threat. Next slide, please. And here they are together. Churchill looking rather rustic on the left, and Einstein looking unexpectedly smarter than Churchill on the right in the garden at Chartwell. And Einstein wrote at this time from England to his wife in Belgium, "Churchill is an eminently wise man, and it became quite clear to me that these people have planned well ahead and will act soon." Obviously a reference to the potential action against Nazi Germany. Well, back in Belgium in August, Einstein went still further in attacking the Nazis. He abandoned his former pacifist position very reluctantly and publicly argued for British and French rearmament against Germany. And he also publicly endorsed, very publicly, a new book called The Brown Book of the Hitler Terror. Now, Einstein really became public enemy number one of the Nazis at this time in August. And his life was undoubtedly now in danger, and he had to be officially protected by police officers in Belgium. Next slide, please. And this shows one of the policemen at his house in Belgium by the sea with Einstein and his wife Elsa. And then on the 30th of August 33, Nazi extremists shot an associate of Einstein in Czechoslovakia, the controversial German Jewish philosopher Theodor Lessing. And days later, press reports appeared suggesting that Einstein was the next in line and mentioning a hefty financial reward on his head. Even so, Einstein shrugged his shoulders, but his wife insisted that he immediately go on the run. And on the 9th of September, he discreetly left Belgium with a few bags of vital scientific books and papers, took a boat across the English Channel and headed for London. But instead of going on to Oxford, he settled in the depths of the English countryside. And his host was Churchill's friend, Commander Oliver Locker-Lampson, who owned property in Norfolk. And this MP, Locker-Lampson, who was a veteran of the First World War, sprang into action and offered Einstein accommodation in a holiday hut at an undisclosed location near Cromer. Now, immediately, Einstein informed a British newspaper reporter, "I shall become a naturalized Englishman as soon as it is possible for my papers to go through. However, I cannot tell you yet whether I shall make England my home." Well, a bizarre mixture of secrecy and publicity surrounded this entire visit. Next slide, please. And you can see that in this photograph, which shows Einstein sitting outside the holiday hut with Locker Lampson on the left holding a gun, and his secretary watching Einstein, and then on the far right there's a local gamekeeper with another weapon. Locker Lampson obviously wanted publicity for what he was doing because he gave this photograph to the newspapers. And next slide, please. It appeared on the front page of the Daily Express a day or so later. Now, Einstein wrote to his wife in Belgium, "Locker Lampson is wonderful and keeps everything away. I live here like a hermit, only I do not need to eat roots and herbs." And here, next slide, please, is another photo of him at this time, solitary like a hermit, near the holiday hut, but nobody knows who took this photo. And I think he spent most of his time alone. Now, there's also a wonderful caricature of him at this time by the political cartoonist David Lowe, published in October, which I think captures Einstein's solitude rather beautifully. Next slide, please. And it shows him as a wild-haired, absent-minded professor walking slowly towards a dark shadow. Now, the only major interruption at this time in the hut was a visit from the sculptor Jacob Epstein, arranged by Locker Lampson. And Epstein came to this not-so-secret hideaway in Norfolk to prepare a model for a magnificent bronze bust of Einstein, which is today in the Tate Gallery in London. Next slide, please. And this photograph, which I love, shows Einstein suitably, casually dressed on the left, the model of him in the middle, and Jacob Epstein looking slightly smarter on the right. And that's taken in Norfolk. And there's an autobiography, a famous autobiography by Epstein, where he vividly describes Einstein at this time. He says, "Einstein appeared dressed very comfortably in a pullover with his wild hair floating in the wind. His glance contained a mixture of the humane, the humorous, and the profound. And this was a combination which delighted me. He resembled the aging Rembrandt." Now, unfortunately, there was too little time for Epstein to complete the model because Einstein had to get back to London to make a speech at the Royal Albert Hall. And this event, organized by this dynamic Locker Lampson, was to raise money for Jewish academic refugees from Germany. And other speakers at the event included the physicist Ernest Rutherford, the politician Austin Chamberlain, and the economist William Beveridge. And needless to say, the Albert Hall was completely packed out, including a delegation of black shirts from Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists. And outside, large numbers of policemen were stationed in the streets to respond to a rumor of a possible terrorist attack, which fortunately didn't happen. Now, next slide, please. Here's Einstein speaking at the Albert Hall. He read quietly from his English manuscript, and behind him is Rutherford and Chamberlain seated. He read quietly, and he clearly had the attention of the entire audience because they were silent and then bursting into massive applause on occasion. And at one point he said, "If we want to resist the powers which threaten to suppress intellectual and individual freedom, we must keep clearly before us what is at stake and what we owe to the freedom which our ancestors have won for us after hard struggles. Without such freedom, there would have been no Shakespeare, no Goethe, no Newton, no Faraday, no Pasteur, and no Lister. And of course, no Einstein." And this remark prompted a storm of sympathetic applause. And then he made a radical, idiosyncratic suggestion, probably only he could have made it, for encouraging scientific creativity. And it was apparently based on a lighthouse near his recent retreat by the sea in Norfolk. He suggested, could not unemployed creative young people, including perhaps refugees from Germany, who wanted to think out scientific problems be appointed as lighthouse keepers, where they would have ample time for solitary reflection? Well, immediately a Daily Express cartoonist depicted this idea with a wild-haired lighthouse keeper, Professor Stan Baldstein. Next slide, please. And there is the lighthouse with Professor Baldstein holding a candle at the top with lots of hair. And it's called Stormy Weather, that's the caption. Now, afterwards, on the steps of the Albert Hall, Einstein told the reporter in German, I could not believe that it was possible that such spontaneous affection could be extended to one who is a wanderer on the face of the earth. The kindness of your people has touched my heart so deeply that I cannot find words to express in English what I feel. I shall leave England for America at the end of the week, but no matter how long I live, I shall never forget the kindness which I've received from the people of England. Well, he never returned to Britain after 1933, and in fact, he never came back to Europe from America. But he never lost touch with Britain, and in April 1955, just days before his death, he signed the Russell-Einstein Manifesto. Next slide, please. And there is the LP recording by Russell of the manifesto released after Einstein's death. And at the same time as his death, just after his death, the Washington Post published a classic cartoon. Next slide, final slide, please. And it's called Einstein Lived Here on the planet Earth in the universe. And it's by Herblock, the cartoonist. And I think it hints at why Einstein, who was proverbially a citizen of the world, chose to abandon Europe, including Britain, forever in October 33. His reservations about English formality, the dreaded dinner jacket expressed in his Oxford diary and elsewhere, did play some part in his decision, and so did his insoluble family entanglements with his first wife and his mentally ill younger son in Switzerland. And so too did his fear of further entrapment by the anti-Nazi cause following the Albert Hall event, and also his prescient expectation of a brutal war with Germany. But I think the most important reason of all why Einstein wanted to stay in America was that he wanted to be in a place where he was absolutely free to think about theoretical physics, either on his own or in conjunction with other leading experts from all over the world, entirely at his own wishes, whenever he wanted to. And Princeton had the newly founded Institute for Advanced Study, founded in 1933, and he was really the first honored guest. And it offered him this prospect of freedom without any lecturing or committee or social obligations, unlike established universities such as Oxford and Cambridge. For Einstein, science, the planet as a whole, if you like, always took precedence over nation. At heart, he said, I am a gypsy, nowhere at home. As an alien in America, Einstein was able to remain apart from society whenever he chose to. Not so in Europe, the land of his birth. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It is fascinating, and the more I think about it, an incredibly melancholy story. I'd like to tease some of that out. First of all, by asking you about the relationship between Einstein's Jewishness and his reservations about Zionism.
Well, his reservations about Zionism were that he didn't really wish to belong to a political movement for a Jewish national home. He really felt he supported the idea in principle, but he never really, being this gypsy that he was, wanted to belong to any political movement. And I think it's fair to say he never joined a political movement. The closest he came to it was his pacifist stand, where he did belong to a pacifist movement. But even that he, so to speak, resigned from in 1933 after the Nazis came to power. So Zionism, he was sympathetic to their aims, but he didn't really want to be seen as one of their representatives. I mean, to some extent, he agreed to be a representative because he did go to the United States in 1921 to raise money for the Zionist cause. He gave lectures, and so he was supportive, but his relationship with Chaim Weizmann, who later became, you know, the first president of Israel, was a very kind of, it was full of disputes. There was sympathy, but there was also a lot of disagreement. And it's fair to say that Einstein never went back to Palestine after 1923. Weizmann very much wanted him to come and be a lecturer at the Hebrew University, but Einstein never went, even after the Second World War, after the Holocaust. He never went back.
I think we've lost Stuart there. We've been having problems all day with internet in the borders, which seems to be a real problem, especially when it rains. So I'm sorry, I'm Adrian Turpin. I'm the director of the Wigtown Book Festival. I'm just going to take over. Hopefully we'll be able to get Stuart back, but let's keep it moving as we've only got a certain amount of time. It's fascinating talk, Andrew. I've got a question from Cher here, who says, what do you most like about Einstein as a personality, rather than as a physicist or as a genius? You know, I think you mentioned in the popular imagination, one of the things we see about Einstein is that he's seen as this kind of humorous character. And you mentioned the kind of the Rembrandt reference. How do you think that sort of played out in the way that he's been treated through history, in the way that he's regarded?
Well, I think he was a modest man in many ways, and it comes out again and again, even in his physics. He was always prepared to be corrected by others if he felt it was justified. He had a lovely sense of humor. Again and again, you find yourself laughing at his jokes. I mean, one of my favorites, he refers to that his contempt of authority. He's been punished for his contempt of authority because fate has made me an authority myself. And this is part of his modesty, that he was a bit embarrassed, undoubtedly, by the cult that surrounded him in later life. And I think he's impudent as well. I mean, as a young man, he says impudence is my guardian angel, because he didn't take easily to authority, whether in school or college, or in the Zionist movement, or obviously Nazis. He said, I can't stand German Zwang, this word meaning compulsion. And I think that's an endearing and an enlightening part of Einstein's personality. You see as kind of unity in his life, his aversion for authority, and yet ironically he became an authority himself, in not just in physics, but you know, the Einstein-Russell manifesto. He was considered the world's leading scientist, and Russell approached him first and said, you know, we've got to stop the world from destroying itself with nuclear weapons. Are you prepared to join me in trying to get other leading scientists to sign this manifesto? And they got a number of scientists, but it was Einstein's name that drew these people. And I'm afraid they couldn't get a Soviet scientist. They were hoping they might get somebody, but they got a Polish scientist who won a Nobel Prize, but they couldn't get a Russian scientist, even though Einstein was revered as a physicist in Russia.
I mean, it's very clear that he managed to make himself, he managed to become seen as a kind of ethical figure. But I guess in some ways he wasn't necessarily the greatest judge of character in some ways. I mean, lots of other physicists and scientists, dissidents were fleeing Germany way before 1933. And it sounds to me from your book that he didn't really necessarily take the German threat, the Nazi threat, as seriously as others did. I mean, he was surprised, wasn't he, that people were, that Hitler was. There were rumours that Hitler was setting out to kill him in Chroma.
Well, I think that was part of his modesty. Honestly, he didn't value his life as much as his wife did and other people did. He did say that the threat is probably true. But I must await events. And it was his wife who said to him in Belgium, you've got to leave. At one time, they thought of going on a cruise to nowhere. In fact, it was announced in the New York Times that they were going on a ship's cruise to nowhere with nobody being told where they were going. But they abandoned that plan. And Einstein left her behind in Belgium and went to England. I think he was pretty prescient about the Nazis, but he didn't judge terribly well the post-war situation, because he and Max Born differed radically about whether to treat all Germans as guilty of what had happened during the Nazi period or only the majority. And Born said to him, I found many exceptions in my post-war experience of Germans, and I think it's time for us to change our minds on this. Even if we felt hostile to the entire nation during the war, there are exceptions, among them the German Quakers who Born knew. And Born had suffered far more. His family had lost many more people in the concentration camps than Einstein's friends and family. Einstein actually got off relatively lightly, but Born had suffered very much, and people had committed suicide to avoid being sent to concentration camps in his family. So in a sense, you would have expected Max Born to be more resistant to understanding Germany than Einstein, but Einstein had an authoritarian streak towards the Germans. He couldn't abide what had happened, and he felt that they should be punished or as a group. So I think in that sense, he was a bit insensitive and didn't treat individuals as individuals. He treated every German as part of a group.
That's very interesting. And when you mentioned, so he pitches up, and he pitches up in England, and he could end up anywhere, but he ends up in this hut, basically in the middle of the country in Chroma. Yeah. And this chap, Oliver Locker-Lampson, a Conservative MP, he was quite a curious fellow. Why? I mean, it seems a kind of unlikely. Why Locker-Lampson? Why was it Locker-Lampson who became the kind of saviour, the pick-me-up for
Yes. Well, I have to admit that Locker-Lampson doesn't fascinate me, but does puzzle me. I did get a shock when I read Locker-Lampson's article of 1930, I think in the Daily Mirror. 1930 is a key year because Hitler was coming into prominence, and Locker-Lampson wrote in the Daily Mirror an article basically claiming that Hitler was a thoroughly admirable figure and had learnt the rules of cricket from English prisoners of war during the First World War, and he then had a match with these prisoners of war. And Locker-Lampson doesn't say whether Hitler's team or the British team won, but he claims that Hitler thought cricket was a rather fine game, and that this suggests that he was a decent sort. And then you find, to your amazement, that he's changed his mind totally within 3 years, because by 1933, Locker Lampson still has a little bit of respect for Hitler, but he's become an admirer of Einstein, and he's offering his house in London to him, and then in Norfolk. And he was a sort of gung-ho figure, pretty upper class. He wanted fame. He wanted to be a celebrity. I think there's no doubt that associating with Einstein was a mixed motive for him. He genuinely and undoubtedly felt sympathy for the Jews and the refugees. There's no question about that. He made a lot of effort to help Jewish refugees after Einstein and he had parted company. But it has to be said that he took up Einstein partly, I think, to attract publicity to himself. And he gave a speech in the House of Commons, which is quite a moving speech. Locker Lampson had a 10-minute speech where he appealed for the House to vote in favor of giving Jewish refugees Palestinian citizenship so they could escape from Germany. And it is quite moving. So his feeling was genuine for the Jews, and Einstein felt that, undoubtedly felt that. And I think Einstein was actually drawn to Locker Lampson's gung-ho sort of dynamic personality. It's surprising because Locker Lampson was pretty conservative in his outlook, and Einstein was not particularly conservative. But he admired that side of Britain. He said he admired whoever it was in England who said, "When in doubt, act." And I think Locker Lampson was a living embodiment of that motto.
And did Einstein have time to sort of get together a set in a group of people that he socialized with at all while he was in the UK, or was he a solitary figure during that time?
The musicians certainly were very important to him in Oxford. He was close to them, particularly a woman called Margaret Denicky, who organized the concerts where he played. I wouldn't call him close to Lindemann, his host, but he had quite a bit of respect for him as a physicist. But they lost touch after 1933 because Lindemann was very political and Einstein, on the whole, was driven by science, not politics. Max Born was a refugee who'd come and they were friendly. But I think, to answer your question straightforwardly, the answer is there were people he got on with very well, and some of them were quite famous in their way, but there was nobody who you could say became a lifelong friend as a result of his time in England. I think that's a fair comment.
I want to ask you a little bit more about this. You mentioned it earlier, this idea of Zwang, if that's the right way to pronounce it. Yeah. This German idea of force or coercion, which seemed to be quite an unusual idea to be so central to Einstein's thinking and to his life and to influence him in all sorts of ways. Is that a fair enough thing to say? And could you say a little bit more about it?
Well, it's partly personal, undoubtedly. Individual to him. He didn't get on very well at school. There was one teacher in his secondary school who said to him that you'll never make anything of your life because you're too impudent. And Einstein rejected the school and he rejected Germany as a child. And he left Germany to go to Italy where his parents were living. And he, in a sense, turned against Germany as a boy because of what he felt he'd experienced at school. But I think it goes way back to his early childhood, where he seems to have been very, very individualistic and solitary. And you find this concept of private study very important in his life, even as a young man and even as a boy. He just doesn't like listening to authority trying to teach him things. He'd prefer to teach himself, either by talking to other people or by reading.
I think sorry, Andrew. I was going to say, I think that's one of the interesting things, which was this sort of idea. On the one hand, he's a bit like, it's the old visual illusion of the rabbit and the duck. On the one hand, he is individualistic and solitary. On the other hand, he is this great figure who sees that he has a place in the universe that brings people together, and that's a very fascinating dichotomy.
Yes, it is. It is. You're absolutely right. And he does feel that he has to join, to some extent, important causes, even though they cause him problems. The Zionist cause is there. The pacifist cause, which was deeply unpopular in the First World War in Germany. I mean, he was one of the really quite courageous scientists who openly signed a manifesto against militarism, whereas virtually every other scientist had famously signed a manifesto in favor of militarism and supporting the German behavior. And I'm talking about scientists here, I'm not talking about soldiers. Einstein stood out against that. And later, he absolutely feels that he has to stand up against nuclear weapons, having resigned as a pacifist during the 1930s and feeling, I think, somewhat ashamed of it, his resignation, and supported the war effort. He then learns after 1945 that Heisenberg and the German physicists had not made much progress in building an atom bomb. And he feels ashamed because he was under the impression that the Germans were going to build a bomb and would succeed in dropping it. And that's why he supported the Manhattan Project in America. But when he learns that is historically not true after the war, he suddenly thinks, I must stop all my support for American nuclear weapons, and I must stand up and be counted with Bertrand Russell and others. And he obviously feels he has a role, and he owes it to the world to use his position, his fame as a scientist, to do good.
And was there way so he supported the lesser of two evils, and then found out that he didn't really need to support any evil. Where did that sort of moral certainty come from? Was that his parents? Was it what was it in his background that brought him that sort of? So I mean, there are lots of scientists who are not like that. There are lots that are. I
think not so much from other scientists, although he had associations with quite moral scientists, including people like Born. I think it came ultimately from a mixture of his mother, to some extent his father, but not too strongly. They were good people, but they were not really remarkable people, mixed with reading of philosophy. He read a lot of philosophy and debated philosophy with his fellow physicists at a famous informal club called the Olympia Academy in Switzerland when they were quite young. And they called it that as a joke, the Olympia Academy, because none of them had any real success in life at that time. And they would debate philosophy. And it mattered to him. Morality mattered to him, and what philosophers had written about it. And I think it continued to matter right through his life. And, you know, he associated with some moral scientists like Marie Curie as well, and others. But I think it was probably some influence from the parents, combined with a lot of thinking. and some mysterious gene we'll never really understand. You know, he had it.
I've got another sort of even more personal question here from Caroline. And she says, and you may or may not know about this, I'm sure. I read Einstein had a baby who died or was put up for adoption with a woman he had a relationship with before he met his wife. Do you know more about this?
Yes. I couldn't say anything about it because there wasn't time. But before his first marriage, he had a relationship with the woman who became his first wife, Mileva Maric, who was a Serbian woman. And they, and this marriage was, this relationship was much opposed, I have to say, by his parents, who felt that she was trouble. And he stood up against them, and he carried on the relationship, and they had a child, and the child was sent back to Serbia. And Einstein scholars have been trying to find out ever since what happened to the child. It seems almost certain that it was, or how it happened. And then Einstein actually got married to Mileva, and they had 2 children who settled in Switzerland. But this is one of the quite telling stories about him as a human being, that he was prepared to go through with that relationship regardless of whether they were married or not, but he couldn't really, I'm afraid, succeed in the physics of that day in the patent office in Switzerland unless he got married. If he had children, he was really compelled to marry if he wanted to have a family.
And am I right in saying, I mean, I think, isn't there also discussion about how much, when he was working in the patent office in Bern, how much Mileva was, she was actually a kind of force within his work. And there's I mean, we've spent a lot of time this week talking about the role of, the very often underplayed role of women in science, that she was actually significant in helping him develop his thinking. Is that true? Or
yes, I've just been reviewing a book by a woman who's a particle physicist in America. It's a new book, and she brings that up. As do many people. I have studied the subject. I've studied the letters which were exchanged between Albert and Mileva before their marriage and after. And I've read a lot on the subject. I don't know what to think, and I don't think anybody else quite does, because the letters are the only evidence we have. There's nothing else really to go on except what Mileva said in later life after the 2 of them were completely at odds, and you know, either before the divorce or after. And the problem is the letters, which are the really valid evidence where they were in love with each other, very much in love with each other, are not clear. I mean, I can say this much, that the letters from Albert are a lot longer, and they deal with science a lot. And he announces several key ideas to her, including his opposition to the concept of the ether. And the trouble is, she doesn't discuss science in the letters, very little. Now, they may have talked in person, and she had a scientific background, and she was remarkable in that way. As a woman at that time, it was very difficult to get a science degree, and she stood up and got it. And he respected her for that, but I'm afraid the evidence is unclear how much she really contributed. It's just not clear. She didn't claim in later life, even though they were no longer friends and almost not on speaking terms, she didn't claim. She made no effort to claim that she had been responsible in any way for his relativity theory. It's
an interesting theory, an interesting area for discussion. I've got two more. Rapidly. Well, we're almost at the end. Probably are at the end. But I've got two more questions I want to sneak in before the end. The first is the idea that is it fair to say that Einstein was a joyous but an unhappy man, and he never, the things that he really wanted to do in his life, particularly to reconcile relativity and Newtonian physics, to have a unified theory, he wasn't unable to achieve, and that was something that bothered him to the end.
Well, yes. Sorry, was there more?
No. Well, I'll come to the final question.
I would never describe him as joyless. Never.
I said joyous, happy man.
I just heard you because of the sound reaction. I think there is no doubt whatsoever that he was frustrated at the end by his endless attempt to unify relativity and quantum physics, but nobody's managed to do it yet. So it's not that surprising. And he was well aware that he would probably fail. He actually said so to people like Max Born. I'm going to carry on, and I can afford to do this because I've made my name, and a younger physicist could not afford this kind of risk. But I can, and so even if I fail, it doesn't matter. I will have tried. And he did. He went on right up to his hospital bed in April 1955. There are lots of papers with mathematics that were left there that he was working on when he died. And that was his greatest passion in life, without any doubt. And that's why he carried on right up to the end. I think that it was very difficult for him to deal with the question of what quantum physics meant. And we can't go into that, but, God does not play dice was his famous line. And he could not accept a probabilistic universe. He felt that physical reality existed and you could measure it. And otherwise, what was physics about? He could not accept that it depended on human perception. It didn't make sense to him, but yet he had made crucial contributions to that point of view with other physicists like Niels Bohr. So that was a source of frustration. And he undoubtedly cut himself off from many physicists, which was a weakness in the final years. Not all.
Well, the last question I'm going to ask you, which is this is the final event, although we do have a podcast coming out tomorrow morning, but it's the final actual event of our Big Bang Week this year. And the final question I want to ask you is, Einstein had a portrait of James Clerk Maxwell on his wall in his study. And of course, Clerk Maxwell is revered. We had a Clerk Maxwell lecture earlier today from Professor Malcolm MacDonald. Clerk Maxwell is revered as one of the senior figures in 20th century science, and certainly among the absolute preeminent figures in Scottish science. What do you think? Why do you think that was the case, that Einstein saw him so highly? And I'm going to say we have to answer this question reasonably quickly, which is a bit like that Monty Python thing. But
well, I remember as a kid, my father was a physicist, and physics mattered hugely to him. And if he mentioned Maxwell, you could almost feel he was saying a little prayer. My father was English, not Scottish. So Maxwell has this kind of effect on physicists all over the world. Still, after so many years after his death. Well, I think Maxwell's ability to combine theory with experimentation and to create the electromagnetic theory in the 19th century, Einstein felt was the height of physics, and that Newton was hugely important, but that Maxwell had made possible Einstein's own work on relativity. Without the electromagnetic theory, he couldn't have started on his own theory. And he said, I owe everything to Maxwell. He actually said that in that when talking to that student. And in 1931, when Maxwell had his birth centenary, Einstein contributed to a symposium published in Cambridge and made equally reverential remarks about Maxwell. But he did add, having made those remarks, that the work is not yet completed. We are still trying to move forward. And that was what he was trying to do.
Well, I think that's a very good way to end not just this event, but Big Bang 2021, Big Bang Week 2021. The work is not yet completed. It will go on. Thank you so much for an absolutely fascinating hour, Andrew. Thank you to everyone who has come to Big Bang Week this year and come to this event, and to everyone who's supported us, including the Kilgallic Community Fund and the Batchworth Trust in particular, but also every individual who's donated. And please, if you haven't donated and you're in a position to, please do, because although these events are free, they still cost us. And it allows us to keep providing events in the future. But I'm going to say thank you again to Andrew. We hope that we'll see you. We'll see you next year for Big Bang. We hope that we'll see you, who knows, even back in Wigtown for the Wigtown Book Festival this year in the autumn. We're very hopeful of that. In the meantime, have a great weekend. Please check out all the extra Big Bang things that we've got on our website. Andrew, thank you.
Thank you, Aidan.